Hello, my name is Brian Forbes. Welcome to Module 13, a case study for EDL 851, Supervision and Evaluation of School Personnel. First thing we're going to look at is the summary of this case study. We have a new principal named Jean Wilson. She's currently in her third year in a new building. Her first couple of years, she took a very hands-off approach, believing not to rock the boat, as her mentor told her. She was lucky enough to be in a building that had a great opinion from the community, where they thought the school was wonderful, had great test scores for students, and so she was really pleased and had no need to try and change anything that wasn't already broken. So this all worked out okay until about midway through her second year. She started getting a lot of parent requests or complaints about a teacher named Mrs. Horton. Mrs. Horton used to be a teacher of the year, but this unfortunately that type of behavior that would have earned her that award has drastically changed. Mrs. Wilson did a little bit of digging where she kind of heard some rumors that Mrs. Horton's husband had left her and her two teenage sons to raise on her own. This would, affect anyone. Mrs. Wilson thought, we'll give it some time and she'll turn things around. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. At the beginning of year 3, Mrs. Wilson, the principal, discovered that many parents were still complaining and making more and more requests at a rapid rate, especially so early in the year, for student transfers to other classrooms. And so this was not good. So Mrs. Wilson allowed for a parent conference to occur between a father of a student who had been claiming that they didn't want to come to school anymore because of Mrs. Horton. Mrs. Horton had repeatedly denied access of that parent to come in to have a meeting, but Mrs. Wilson arranged it anyway. When that father expressed his concerns and relayed what his student had told him, Mrs. Horton screamed at him, telling him he was a liar, at which turn Mrs. Wilson shut down that particular meeting. All right, so in order to come up with a course of action, we first have to identify what are the things that we know, that we don't know, and then what are the problems. The first thing we know is that Mrs. Horton has some kind of problem, whether it's a personal, which is most likely in this case from what we've heard, but it is possible that there's just other things that we're not currently aware of, but we do know there is something wrong with Mrs. Horton. Number 2, we do know that parent requests, especially for student transfers for classrooms, but also for meetings, are occurring and being denied. So we need to look into why that is and why they're happening at a fast rate. And then the last thing is that there are aggressive interactions, not just the ones that we've heard about through staff members, through students and parents, but even the one that we see firsthand through the eyes of Mrs. Wilson at the parent meeting where Mrs. Horton calls him a liar. So some of the things we need to know, number 1, is what evidence do we have of those student interactions? Mrs. Wilson has admitted on her own that she's conducted some walkthroughs and never witnessed any of this behavior, so she's not sure what to do about it. Number 2, we don't know why a teacher would refuse, in this case Mrs. Horton, would refuse the requested meetings from parents. So how can those conferences be denied? And then number 3, what are the policies? We don't know the policies. Maybe Mrs. Horton, according to this school district, is well within her rights to deny parent conferences. Maybe they're only on her own request. We don't know. But then policies for transfers as well, and then even the reprimanding of staff if we find that they are at fault. So we have a couple of problems based on the things that we do and don't know. Number 1, that there's unacceptable behavior. Mrs. Horton is completely in the wrong to yell at a parent, especially to tell them that they are a liar, especially without offering their side of the story in a calm manner first. And then we're having multiple reports that she has unacceptable behavior towards students, which is even worse than the behavior towards the parent. Next, we have the negative effects that are occurring on students. We know for sure that we have one student who says they don't even want to come to school anymore because of Mrs. Horton. And if there's one student who feels this way based on the other parent complaints, more than likely that they are not the only one. And then lastly, we have a negative impact on the school's reputation with the community. The community is going to look at the school as a place where administration allows staff to mistreat children, to create an unsafe environment, and to emotionally damage their children. And this is not going to be good. So I want to make a course of action that breaks it into 3 categories. I want to do something immediately, I want to do some reviewing in the middle, and then I want to create some ongoing actions as well, not just for Mrs. Horton, but for everyone. So the first thing I want to do is set up some interviews for students to get their side of the story, to parents to see what their students have told them, and then also talk with Mrs. Horton more in depth about what her side of the story is. Perhaps some of these children are doing something unruly that we don't know about because the students, of course, may not relay that part of the story to their parents or to the administration. Instead, they just want to complain about Mrs. Horton. But we may also find out that through these interviews and investigation that Mrs. Horton is indeed mistreating students. I would like to try and also set up some greater supervision for Mrs. Horton just in the short term, whether that creates us or creates a need for us to place a paraeducator or a co-teacher or find other reasons for the school improvement specialist or someone else to be in there to help monitor those classes, especially the classes in which Mrs. Horton is claimed to be mistreating students, because the walkthroughs that Mrs. Wilson is doing is just not allowing enough time for that type of behavior to be assessed. And then also I'd like to place Mrs. Horton on the evaluation cycle. That evaluation cycle isn't always required for all teachers every year, but it would be good in this case because it would ensure that we have evidence written down for Mrs. Horton to use either in her defense to say that in fact this is not what's occurring as the students have claimed, or we could do the flip side of that and we would have evidence to back up the fact that Mrs. Horton, who is in denial of her actions, is indeed violating the rights of students and just professional character on her part as well. In the midterm, or in the short, I would like to review the protocol for student transfers. Is this something that particular district allows for? Is this something that's frowned upon? And what do we do once that many transfer requests have occurred? Next, I would like to look at policies for conferences. Is Ms. Horton actually within her rights to deny those? Do we have to give them outside of normal parent-teacher conference days? I would think the answer is probably yes. But again, without some further review, it's hard to say. And then last, procedures for disciplining staff. If indeed we do find that Mrs. Horton is at fault at mistreating students, what are the next steps that we can take from there? Some of the ongoing things I'd like to do is always create some professional development opportunities, especially for classroom management. It could be that Mrs. Horton, whether she has personal problems or professional, she just, for whatever the reason might be, is just having issues with classroom management and she doesn't know how to handle it properly, so she turns to yelling as a way to keep kids under control, which in turn makes the kids who maybe aren't doing anything wrong feel like she's yelling at them, and it just is not conducive to a very kind atmosphere. Another thing we could do is institute student surveys. Student surveys could be done quarterly, by the semester, even yearly. I think quarterly is probably a good, what I would idealize anyway, but semester probably would be a good compromise for students to be able to say, look, this is what we like about class, these are things we don't like about class, but they need to be questions that are designed and measured through administration. So they'd be questions about classroom management, about instructional practices, learning styles, about even classroom seating options. So all of these things could be looked at and then they could be given to the teacher so that they could analyze the way the students see their class. Because sometimes teachers might believe that they're doing a great job and students might actually see it some other way. So my course of action here is going to allow three main things to happen. Number one, for me to outline clear expectations for staff. That way Mrs. Horton or any other staff member can never claim that they were not aware that they were supposed to give parents conferences upon request, or to allow students to transfer, or that they didn't know it was wrong to yell at parents and call them liars. That's not going to be good. Number two, I'm going to raise student engagement. I want to make sure that happens because engagement on the behalf of students raises then academic performance on tests, on regular assignments. It gets them to turn in homework more often, and those are all important aspects of the building, the school. And then teachers also need to access multiple versions of feedback. If it's only their own feedback they ever get, or if it's only from administration, it could be seen as biased. It could be seen as overly negative. But if they get similar feedback from students and families, all from these surveys, they can use those as a tool to reflect upon their own idea of what is going on in the classroom so that they can grow professionally. So as I reflected upon this, I thought of three things. Number one, kind of what was I thinking? It seems that Mrs. Horton does have a problem, but is it enough to identify that she has a problem I don't know. And I don't know if we can offer Mrs. Horton the kind of help that she's going to need to overcome this. I know with students, we would look at this and say, oh, well, they need some time with the counselors. We would arrange that for them or with other specialists. But what can we do on Mrs. Horton's behalf? I'm not 100% sure yet. I feel a little nervous about digging into the personal life of a staff member, especially someone underneath me that could say these are inappropriate questions and none of my business. But at the same time, I'm thinking that, even though it's personal, if it's affecting your professional life and it's especially impacting the students under my care as a building principal, as an administrator, then it is my business and I need to see whatever I can do to help combat that. And then ultimately, I'm always valuing students. I'm valuing their belief in education. I'm valuing their interactions with staff members because I understand that their desire to continue their education, to be passionate about school, really starts with the relationships they build with teachers, and I need to make sure those are positive ones. So as a building administrator, I want to promote the academic success of every student. I'm going to do this by allowing some students to be transferred from time to time. It's going to have to be with good evidence. It's definitely not going to be just at the beginning of one single request. But I need to create a process to look into when that need actually occurs, not just on the one request. And then as a building administrator, I'm going to promote the well-being of every student. I'm going to encourage students and parents to share their concerns openly with staff and administration. This should not be a place where they feel like if they voice their opinion that it's going to be swept under the rug or they're going to be yelled at and they're not going to get any support. And then I also want to enhance the instructional capacity for students. And I feel like that's going to happen if students feel like they have a voice, if they feel like people care about them and that they have their best interest at heart. Definitely not if they have a teacher who's yelling at them. So as an educational leader, I'm going to promote the academic success of every student by providing a positive atmosphere. That's the first thing that has to occur. In a negative atmosphere in a classroom, if there's no classroom management or if there's no trust between students and teachers, then no learning is going to occur. Next, I'm going to support the reflection of the purpose for continued growth, especially for the teacher in the room, so that they can then analyze that data to identify areas that they can actually improve upon. Again, it's not always enough to have self-reflection without data, and that data could come in the form of student surveys. And then I would supply staff with the proper training to reach students. Classroom management and other instructional practices can be dealt with through professional development, and that professional development is always best identified through proper evaluation. Another thing I'd like to do is promote the well-being of every student through a couple of things. The first one is by asking stakeholders their opinions. Those stakeholders could be students, parents, other staff members, but we need to get some surveys filled out so that we understand how people feel, not just what people see or hear. I also want to provide positive relationships. Those will model healthy attitudes and views on learning. So when students see positive, healthy relationships with staff members, they understand the way that they're then supposed to behave, and they also understand the way they're supposed to interact with other people. And then those positive interactions will lead to respect and trust, which allows for learning to occur. And then I would like to model a system for reporting misbehaviors. Students need to understand that no one should be allowed to mistreat them. That has something to do with bullying from peers. It has everything to do with adults mistreating them in any fashion, whether physically, verbally. Abuse is not going to be tolerated, and they should have a voice to speak up, and then there should be results or courses of action as a result of them speaking up. And then the last thing is that in order to enhance instructional capacity, I'm going to provide professional development for my staff. The most important thing that we can do is ensure that classroom management is occurring in every classroom. Now, it doesn't have to look the same in every classroom. Yes, there are different procedures and practices for different teachers, but we need to ensure that they're getting the management skills that they need in order to have a smooth running classroom. I also want to ensure that class time is dedicated to instruction with less disruptions. That means if we have a student in the back who is acting up and the teacher has to yell at them, or when yelling occurs or other disruptions, students have a break in their concentration, and that's hard to recover from sometimes, especially if you're afraid it's going to happen again. And then lastly, giving students and parents tools to influence the appropriate instruction for individuals. Parents need to have a say in what their students are learning. not only what they're learning, but how they're learning it and who they're learning it from. This is very important to create that positive relationship with the community, to increase our reputation, and also to have more buy-in on the parts of parents and students. When we have that buy-in from all the stakeholders, we create a conducive atmosphere for learning. So all of this would be my course of action, my reasoning behind it.